Yascha Mounk, welcome to our show, and thanks for bringing this great book, The Great Experiment. After everything we have discussed in this show, which is not very optimistic, are you still an optimist about the future of democracies?
Well, it's a funny question to be asked because I'm generally known as a pessimist, and there's good reasons for that. I've been worried for a long time about the rise of authoritarian populists like Marine Le Pen. We're seeing an authoritarian resurgence around the world, with Russia and China becoming much more powerful, much more influential on the world stage than they were 10 or 20 years ago. So all of those are reasons for pessimism. But I also worry that part of the reason for this weakness of democracy is that we're overly pessimistic about the state of our democracies internally. But we're too pessimistic about what's going on in Dutch society today. But we're too pessimistic about the success of countries from Germany to the United States in actually integrating a lot of immigrants, in dealing with its growing ethnic and religious diversity.
So what are you saying? That we don't reflect on ourselves in an honest way? That we're not looking precisely what maybe the advance is that we have made? Well,
let's think about why Marine Le Pen is so popular right now in France. She's been very clever at speaking about issues about the standard of living and economic stagnation. That also comes from a fear about the future, that there's a real economic decline, but we're going to be poorer in the future. But her main calling card still is...
in the future, inflation is crazy. People are poorer today than they were half a year ago.
Well, right, we have a lot of inflation now, but we've also actually had an increase in wages for the first time in a long while, in the last five or so years. But I think her main calling card still is fear about immigration and fear about the ability to integrate newcomers into the society. And on that front, there's a weird kind of double pessimism, where the right and the far right is pessimistic because people like Madame Le Pen say, all these people who are coming into the country are somehow inferior, they're culturally inferior, perhaps they're even biologically inferior. And then a lot of people in the mainstream or on the left of society say, well, that's untrue, I don't agree with that. We shouldn't blame immigrants. But actually it's true that they can't integrate, that they can't make economic or educational progress because our society is so unjust and so discriminatory and so racist. And so that's why they can't succeed. And so both sides are actually agreed in describing the present state of our democracies really, really negatively and saying that the future is going to be worse.
If at the end of this day, this Sunday, Marine Le Pen wins from Macron in the first round of the presidential elections, would you then swallow your words and say, yes, there is a problem with democracies?
Well, I've never said that there's no problem with democracies. My last book, For People versus Democracy, was one of the first to argue that populism poses a real threat to democracy. Mm-hmm. And this book, by the way, which is about diversity in contemporary democracies, is very clear on the fact that making diverse societies work is much harder than most people think. Most diverse societies in the history of the world have gone very, very badly wrong. So, you know, I actually am in many ways a pessimist by instinct, and I certainly think it's possible that more democracies will die, as Russian and Hungarian democracy has died, as Turkish democracy is dying, and Indian democracy is dying, and we might certainly experience the same in France if Marine Le Pen wins. We might, by the way, experience the same in the United States if Donald Trump or one of his allies is re-elected in 2024. But the question is, how do we actually fight against that? Okay, let's talk about that, because your publisher here has the subtitle in this book, Waarom multiculturele samenlevingen uiteenvallen en hoe ze kunnen standhouden. You're using this word, multicultural society, which for the longest time in the Netherlands has been almost a curse word in some cycles, at least. But you basically write in this book, we need a multicultural society. It's the only way to go up. Well, it really depends on what you mean by multicultural. I think there's this idea of multicultural, which basically stands for communitarian vision, where you don't think of Dutch society as composed of individuals with rights and duties anymore, but as a kind of collection of groups. And each of those groups have rights, and the members of those groups never really interact. And I think that that is a big mistake. And that understanding of multicultural, I certainly am against it. I think that we need to build a society in which individuals have the right to give great importance to their own group, to worship as they please, to have friends that are mostly drawn from the same cultural or religious background. But we also need to have them have a right to leave their groups, to interact very strongly with other people. And society is going to be stronger if as many people as possible make the choice to interact, to live together in a meaningful way. But the starting point from a book is a much more simple one, which is that a country like the Netherlands now is very ethnically and religiously diverse. And it has to figure out how to keep the peace. It has to figure out how to live with that diversity.
Are you saying there is no other way?
Well, nations have a right to decide about how much immigration they want, for example. And I think it's perfectly legitimate for the Netherlands to decide how much immigration it wants to have going forward. But you have a lot of citizens who are already in the country, who have a legal title to be here, many of whom are citizens of this country, who do have a different ethnic or religious background. And it is absolutely imaginable that that might change, but that would mean what it usually meant in history when diverse societies fall apart. It would mean deep forms of oppression, it would mean murder, it would mean civil war, it would mean genocide. So that is certainly not a future that I think you should be taking seriously as an option.
And these are the topics that we have been talking about in this program. All of them are now on the table: genocide, war, atrocities. You were born in Germany, Munich, 1982. How does your family history tie up with the book that you have written now?
So I come from a Jewish family. My great-grandparents died in the Holocaust. My grandparents lost much of their family. My parents actually were thrown out of Poland at the age of 20 in a big state-sponsored anti-Semitic pogrom in 1968. So I think one of the things that I've taken from my family's history is that the best we can achieve in politics is perhaps less important than avoiding the absolute worst that can happen, the kind of things that are now going on in Bucha and in other places in Ukraine. But that, to me, also influences my view of our societies today. I think that there are immigrants who are not integrating, that exists. There certainly is racism and discrimination against outsiders, that exists. And we need to fight against those problems and take them seriously. But I also think that compared to most diverse societies in the history of the world, compared to very many places around the world today, we are actually doing relatively well. And we need to build on the improvements of the last decades, and we need to build on the strengths of our societies today to make sure that we don't see what has happened in the European past, but we don't see what's happening in Bucha today.
Yeah. What I liked in your book, the anecdote about your mom, you are walking with her on the streets of Munich, and when she sees fans of Bayern München, soccer fans, she will cross the street and walk somewhere else. She's trying to avoid crowds and the people that like soccer. Why, and how did that influence you?
Well, I think there's a natural tendency when you look at history to think being a member of a group can make you do these terrible things. Humans have this really strong instinct to form groups, and once they identify as a member of a group, they have an instinct to favor those who are also part of a group and discriminate against others who are not. And so when I was 20, I had a vision of the world and the future where I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we're all cosmopolitans, if we're all individualists, if we don't define ourselves by any group in particular?
People like yourself, because you are living in the United States, in New York, you are one of the member of this tribe.
In many ways I am personally, but I think I've come to realize that that is a naive vision of how people work. I myself, when something terrible happens in a city I know that I have a connection to, I'm more affected psychologically.
Do you cross the street?
No, I don't anymore. But when something bad happens somewhere I know, I'm more affected by it than when something bad happens very far away. So I'm still a member of groups. And so the way to build diverse societies that work is not to abolish all groups. It is to allow people a double freedom, to be members of those groups in a meaningful way, but also to make sure that those groups don't define society, that we don't have that we don't go back in a country like the Netherlands to the kind of polarization of society that used to define the country 50 years ago, but that the society looks more like it does today, where people might be Catholic or Protestant, that still has a role to play, but that it doesn't structure all of society.
Yeah. We talked in this conversation and this program about the possibility that Marine Le Pen will win the elections in France. You just mentioned maybe the former President Trump could win in 2024. And maybe President Putin could win his war in Ukraine. Are we on a crossroad today in history?
Yes, I think we are. It is true that the holiday from history that you enjoyed here in the Netherlands, that we enjoyed in Germany for the last decades is over. But we are in a moment of intense competition between democracy and dictatorship. And this will determine the fate of peoples like Ukraine that have a misfortune of being in the supposed sphere of influence of some great power. It will also influence how we live domestically, because as long as your country is dependent on energy from Russia and on economic trade from China, you're not going to be free to make your own decisions within your own country either. You're not going to have true freedom of speech while having to avoid the wrath of Beijing. And you're not going to have an independent foreign policy while being dependent on energy from Moscow. And that's a lesson that Germany, the Netherlands, many other European countries urgently need to learn. Yeah.
How come that a lot of people don't see that path that you are describing now?
You know, when you've been on holiday and it's been really wonderful and, you know, the sun is setting and it's getting a little bit chilly and, you know, you have to, you know, go and drive back home and go to work the next day, you'd rather stay on the beach for longer and pretend that it's still warm.
And that's the state we are in now?
I fear so.
Mm-hmm. So what's the message that you want to give to us?
Well, the message is twofold. I think liberty is costly. It takes effort. And sometimes it takes some short-term sacrifices. We need to become more optimistic about our ability to deal with our internal problems. We need to put more energy, more resolve into actually solving our internal problems. And it's only if we are more optimistic about ourselves that we can then also muster the will to stand up against really dangerous dictators like Vladimir Putin on the international stage.
In your 10th chapter in this book, you suggest 3 maxims to solve the crisis that we are in now. Stick to your principles, be willing to criticize your own, and don't ridicule or vilify, but engage and persuade. Why do you see these 3 elements as a possible solution for people who are pessimistic about democracies and the state of the world that we see today?
Well, it's not a silver bullet, and it's one of many solutions that I talk about in the book. But I do worry that we're breaking apart into hostile tribes domestically, politically as much as anything else. So there's this deep polarization. And one of the mechanisms of that is that we no longer feel like we're fellow citizens trying to figure out what to do politically, but we're enemy combatants in some battle to the death. And so I see the tendency a lot of the time where when a political opponent says something, you think, I have to believe the opposite, whatever it might happen to be. And that's really bad, because then you're not actually deciding yourself how to think about the world. You're ironically letting your enemy determine what to think for you, because he's going to take the opposite opinion of whatever they say. So I think be guided by the values of liberal democracy, of individual freedom and collective self-determination. Argue for them earnestly. Respect your fellow citizens. Let me perhaps say one thing to close. I do think that there is a lot of disdain for ordinary people today among intellectual and political elites, among which I count myself. This is as much a mea culpa as it is an accusation. But you can't be a true democrat if you think that most of the people, most of the time, are incapable of responding to decent moral reasons. So have a little bit more respect for our own fellow citizens, and let's try to build a vision of a future of our own societies that most of us would actually be excited to live in, because only then can we also stand up for our values against dictators like Putin.
It's a very clear message. One last question at the end of the show. We talked about the war in Ukraine, presidential elections in France. Do you think that Marine Le Pen will have a chance to win tonight?
I think Emmanuel Macron is likely to come in first place tonight, but Marine Le Pen has a real chance of winning in the second round of the elections in a few weeks. I would say it's perhaps a 1/3 chance, which sounds comforting, but that's about the chance that models gave Brexit of happening, of Donald Trump of winning. And I think the impact, if Marine Le Pen does win in a few weeks, is as dire as it was when Trump won and when Brexit happened.
We'll wait and see. Yascha Mounk, thank you so much for your time here at Buitenhof. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bedankt voor het kijken. Vond je dit een goed gesprek? Vergeet dan niet te abonneren. Een like of een reactie achterlaten kan natuurlijk ook. Of bekijk een van de andere interviews op dit kanaal.